Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the ACSA team for having me here. Never been to Quebec before this, so it's a lovely new extension of my experiences. I would like to summarize my own position towards those rapid urbanization-related urban transformations that are the sign of our times through this title, Building Knowledge, Building Community. First of all, this title, Building Knowledge, begins with the time when I graduated already in 1990. At that time, we sort of knew all of these environmental problems. We knew that there's going to be major socio-economic disruptions and so on. And somehow when I graduated, I had already figured out that we need to develop a new knowledge to be able to build more appropriately. But over the years, now 2 or 3, almost 3 decades later, I know that all of those problems have gotten much more vast and complex. Nothing has improved. Everything is exactly as predicted and much worse. And so that set me thinking right from the beginning. But as a professor today, I use this term, building knowledge, not only to represent knowledge about building, but the act of building the knowledge itself, even through practice, not only in academia. And along with it, the recognition that it goes along with the sense of building community. So I would like to summarize some of the key issues that we were facing and are facing at the moment, labeling some of these major transformation areas. First of all, we have not been able to reduce our population or maintain it. We are still, population is putting a very big concern because it has not been able to be contained. In India, where my practice is based, we are 1/6 of the global population. However, we occupy only 2.4% of the world's land, which means we cannot go by other consumption patterns that developed countries have established. China is also 1/6. So together, only India and China, we are 1/3. So the problem is so large that the fact that we are urbanizing today and following some of the patterns set by the developed countries that had urbanized at a much earlier time, at a slower pace, and we are continuing to transfer exactly those patterns to other areas, and that is a very complex one. But anyway, population and it's the tug of war between development and environment. This is a very big one. In the sense that we have much less resources available per capita. On the other hand, we are faced with rapid rural-urban migration, and along with just the mere numbers of people moving to cities and all the complexities involved when everybody needs a new house, etc., there's also the problem of loss of identity. This migration is no longer contained, because, no longer due to agriculture that cannot sustain and so on. There are global migrations due to political reasons, due to globalization-related jobs, and people move for all kinds of reasons. And we are an uprooted society, increasingly uprooted. And we need to find roots in something, probably not maybe so local, but in any case, that is one of the issues to be faced. Then there's the problem that, the idea of development itself, as seen from the developing countries, and the kind of glass towers, the high consumption buildings that are very taken for granted in the developed countries. This is the kind of rendering that you see in places like Gurgaon, which is on the outskirts of Delhi. This is the promise. This is what people are aspiring. And that is quite worrying because centrally air-conditioned buildings of that nature in a context where people, the elite, have 1 or 2 rooms that are air-conditioned in a house at the most. So there's an infrastructure to sustain all of this. And you can see that, if you see the upper part of buildings, you'll see that it could look like Singapore, Dubai, wherever, Frankfurt, Brisbane. But if you look at the lower part, you'll see that it's got cows and goats and pigs, and in every frame you'll find that. And you see the unprepared ground for that. Most of all, this kind of urbanization continues to perpetuate disparity and creates three kinds of urban forms. If you see the skyline, they are all very distinct, even though when you're on the ground, you see them interwoven and you don't really realize what's going on in that chaos. But actually, if you look at it, this is a picture again on the outskirts of Delhi. So in every town, where there is the peripheral area that is not contained in the master plan, are subject to this kind of development. So there are highways, etc., where people are randomly growing because of the absence of regulations. And then there are planned sectors that are developer-driven, for which there are enough empty apartments that can't be sold that exactly correspond to the homeless. In many, many cities in the world, you find that those figures are matching, because all this is created through bank loans, but actually they cannot be sold because nobody can afford that price of a house. On the other hand, in order to be able to build this kind of quantity of buildings, people are moving to the cities, and you see the foreground of the informal settlements of the same number of people who, you feel these people might as well occupy those apartments, if you see the numbers. So this is this kind of two separate cities in one is the emerging skyline, actually. And this is something you see in all the countries where urbanization is now currently taking place, whether it's in Africa, South America, Asia. Everywhere you see that the gap is getting bigger. The towers are getting taller. The high-budget houses are getting more high-tech and high-rise, and the informal settlements are widespread. In Bombay, it's more than 60%. So the majority are informal. So that's really means we need to radically rethink if the formal is a minority. So finally, apart from all those concerns, one of the really big concerns for me personally was this aspect of the materiality of architecture itself. Because having grown up in a context where we have seen, we know how to live with much less resources than we see coming up, around us. And the model of development that is being sold, and it's the only model that exists now, it's all very high consumption. Even the green buildings, as approved by various, whether it's LEED or whoever, all these rating systems result in buildings that are actually way more high consumption than the normal buildings in those countries. How can one justify this kind of thing, So how can we say that a global standard of green, how green is green enough, I think has to be really defined. Because if one just reduces energy consumption to 20 or 30%, and you get a pat on your back in a certain context, but you go to another context and get a platinum certificate for using 70% more than everybody else. So these are the kind of confusions that happen. And, in this diversity of, traditionally and in vernacular architecture all over the world, according to the climate, according to materials available, we already have a huge atlas of how to build, everywhere in the world, with what is there. And rather than going on with that culture, we've de-linked from all local building trends, and rather than, for instance, if a certain tile is not available, is not possible to be used because there's no more wood to support it, rather than making the next subtle advance, we tend to throw the baby with the bathwater, and what we have is reinforced cement concrete as a vernacular building material, at least in most developing countries now, and bricks, which are not even allowed to carry load anymore. All despite all the cathedrals we built and large span tall buildings, we just use, bricks are allowed to be only used because of various norms as fillers. So all the knowledge seems to be redundant, and the way we are building, it's like everything is become one common standard approach. And in these countries, cement and steel are considered high energy materials. There's not enough to go around. One has to save them judiciously for areas where it's really required. So in this kind of context, I want to share a little bit with you my personal journey, especially for the students who are here, so that I don't want to just show you projects, I'd rather show you the kind of thinking that is behind, that led me, and what I was doing in my own life, actually. All the risks I took personally, etc., that led me to have the courage also to take risks in the profession. So what happened is, I left Bombay after with all those type of questions, meaning of life and everything, what to do with the profession and so on. Also being disillusioned with the practice, that sharp difference when you are idealistic and you come to the practice. So I moved to a rural area and where actually an international city was planned called Auroville. But I joined in this experience, and I built this house for myself, a hut actually. This was my own solution to affordability, because I didn't want to just be in the rat race and spend all my time, being just slaving for projects that I didn't believe in. And only in order to meet my own cost of living, I preferred to live with less and have the freedom to be an architect. I think that was the boldest decision I took, actually, to not be in a hurry, just decide to postpone that bad decision for one more week and another week, and just see how long your resources would last. Write some articles, do whatever, but don't do what you don't believe in doing. That was my main, I stuck to that stance. And I had this motorbike, I had a solar panel, and I lived very, very simply. You can see, it's all very basic. But yes, the importance was that I liberated my time to think. And that's what the rest, everything else that came after, was because I had time. I didn't have other things, but I had the freedom to think my own thoughts and to take the time to know what they are. So that hammock for me represents that space to do nothing. I always still keep some time for that, and space for nothing. So, that was my personal experience that I wanted to just share with you, so that I can take the lecture further by explaining how I began to put a lot of importance in the process, because I realized that you're not going to get a different product without a different process. So for me, to be aware of the process, and even if I did not find if I was not successful with the product, I knew if the process was right, you'll just keep going and it'll get right along the way. So, but the other way around, if I merely repeat what I criticize in the built environment, then if I don't change the process, it's already a failure. So I didn't find the risks I took to be, it was very logical for me, because I had at least a 50% chance of succeeding, whereas the other option for me was already a failure. And with this kind of thought, I must, must say that even in the Venice Biennale, that Aravena's one 2016, when I was asked to give a sketch, this is the sketch I gave, where I felt it's important to talk about the roots and not about the fruits, because in architecture, I think the biggest strength we have in this profession is that we are taught, or we develop a culture to synthesize different knowledges. We can investigate into areas that are seemingly completely unrelated, whether it's about climate, whether it's about demography, whether it's about laws, whether it's whatever it is, technology. And like the trunk of the tree, we can synthesize all these resources. That is one thing, why I feel design could steer the future transition, and should, because we have this capacity. And the expression of that tree, if the roots are where we really invest, then the expression of all of that will result in various products, various fruits. And even if the tree is endangered, the roots will survive, make the tree survive, because it will, even if there's a storm, I mean, it will rebuild and it will go on. So I still, I mean, with this kind of, process-oriented, I try to reveal the process that you don't see, which is underground, in that Biennale. And I will lead you through that process to highlight with these black and white pages for the students in particular who are here, to just share what those strategies are, which I can now summarize 28 years later, So the way I would begin in the process is from the place. Architecture belongs to a place. Even if the idea of a house or a project is global, it still exists in a place, and its materiality is rooted in a place. And the first step for me is to unearth the roots. And I think also it's very important to not study just things for themselves. I think architecture only exists because life exists. And the most important thing for me is architecture belongs in the background to facilitate a life and its activities to happen in a good space. And it should never try to compete with the life that's taking place. It never should come in the foreground, perhaps, even. But so one has to analyze where life, what kind of life has to take place in the place. And there, I found there are two kinds of studies to be made. One is the life of the users. Users would occupy the void. Architecture for me is also mainly a composition of the voids. It's the parts that you don't build are the parts that are useful. So you can occupy and inhabit architecture in those places that you didn't build. So that's the main thing. But for those who actually build, who in order to contain those spaces, they have to be framed with material. And that's where materiality comes in. It is not more important than that. It's there to hold the space. So these materials, we have no need to have fetishes about those materials, or neither have the forms to be airdropped into various contexts. There's some life to take place that can be easily framed. Those spaces can be framed by what is there. And the people who will contribute to the building of that. There are many, many livelihoods from brick making to masonry. Not only the people you see on the building site, all the people you see who manufacture building materials and so on. There's a whole lot of livelihoods who are concerned with the other aspect of. So there are two types of lives that get affected, and economies of people who use the building and are interested in the voids, and the people who make the building and are interested in, they have their skills, they have to live from that. So I started traveling my area, and everything that was taken for granted because I had the time to think, or I made the time to think, I started noticing brick kilns and very basic ways of producing material, but noticing that these brick kilns, when they are fired by casuarina thinnings from reforested plantations. So I started noticing there's a large territorial cycle that we don't notice when you just prescribe materials without connecting to a place. So even a simple brick is very different from another simple brick in another place. And the weak bricks, the non-factory bricks, we used to call them kacha bricks. We didn't respect those bricks much. I realized over time that those are probably the good bricks because they don't use the optimum clay, the optimum quarry. They don't make like a huge intervention with the best clay, the best coal, etc., to get the best strength. They just use what the clay that they have in that area will only go that far. They'll use the fuel that they have, and it's grown by them. And all of that is connected to when the agricultural cycle has got a pause because of the rains or whatever it is. So it's all very well interlinked. And I started realizing how building activity, the building material, starting from the scratch, realizing every building material comes from the ground, whether it's a tree or whether it's cement, whether it is the only difference between manufactured materials and natural materials is that natural materials can be used directly, and manufactured materials need to undergo energy consumption and produce waste as byproduct, and it can go from simple bricks, which is the first manufactured material, to much more complex ones with much more damage. So I started realizing that all those rating systems which give you energy consumption, and then a brick is bad and mud is good and all that, for me, it's not valid anymore. Because for me, it matters where the brick was made. Because these rating systems do not have qualitative energy figures. They just have the kilojoules or whatever. It doesn't take into account human energy and the context in which it's produced and if it's locally sourced or not and so on. So, similarly with the lime industry, when you have communities locally that I didn't even know, I discovered them gradually. I learned how to look, actually, and when I traveled, I learned how to notice. That's the main thing. Just develop the eye for it. And then I noticed that all these communities, if we don't prescribe lime and we prescribe cement, automatically, without thinking, this community is like 4 years ago, these kilns are all closed. Because nobody realizes that their little micro decisions leads to a big shutting down of a whole way of doing something, and we cannot revive that again. But at least to allow these people a generation of 2 of transition. So similarly, I started discovering almost any material. It became like a thread of a sweater you want to keep, pulling and finding out and dismantling the whole sweater. So people who still hand extract granite, from these kind of mountains, I started little by little using some of these in my work. So even if the design looked contemporary, such as in this case, it's a store, these are self-supporting granite slabs. So there's a lot of engineering I'm resorting to engineering to be able to use very less materials. And but still, I try to promote those kind of skills because if those skills are there, I prefer to spend much more of the budget on the local economy and on the people, because that's a direct formula. If people can be enriched, I've heard this a lot in the developed countries. Oh, we can't have people working because it would be too expensive. But if it's much better, even if it's expensive and you allow some of that, instead of just thinking, oh, my poor machine is not working today and it's going to be a big loss. And then, then what about the people? And I think also the human scale that we are losing from the urban environment has also to do with, if you don't work with humans, then the human scale is going to recede. So I started promoting all those in my work in order to just, realize that actually it's a great asset. And we go around, when you don't notice those skills, you tend to think that people in these areas have no skills. We used to call them unskilled labor. It was probably from the British times. All of that was called unskilled labor. And I realized that the unskilled labor were actually quite skilled. They were just not getting the right amount of wages, but they were quite skilled. And there was a lot that you could do with them by, in the sense that there is a knowledge, and it can be critically examined to see what's relevant. So I started producing buildings, taking note of this. So, and reflecting what goes on in the place, through capacities as well as through materials. So, but the important thing in this was critically determining local materials and skills, because in the wake of these kind of huge transformations, even if a material was locally relevant, it doesn't mean that it is still possible. Or sometimes a skill that is foreign can be introduced because there is a labor capacity, but not in that particular material or whatever. So there's a lot of this kind of quite invisible aspects of design that have been introduced to be able to find the appropriate, or to develop the knowledge required to build a building appropriately. So this is what I meant by saying that every project is an opportunity to build knowledge. Because if you have an idea, and then by the end of the project, we've built knowledge as well as built community. This is how it started occurring. So here is an example for, many people know all the things I've done with my pottery and ceramic experience. But basically, in those early days when I lived in that hut, I used to notice potters who were unable to sell their local pots because nobody is going to buy those. There's metalware, and people wouldn't be using those. But they habitually tried to sell, and so there were lots of potters, as there were also bricks. And I started, the first project for me was to work with a Frenchman who actually gave me the first project in Auroville in India. I told him, he was often trying to influence me and telling me, you're new, so I can't let you decide this and that and all that. I used to tell him, okay, please, we'll do a deal. I'm ready to compromise on other things, but not on the roofing system. There should be some things that I'm allowed to test, which nobody can question, because that's what I want to do. And this was my first experience. And then it was no looking back, because one thing led to another. I got involved with the potters community, and if you notice here in this image that look at the environment in which this is being created. It's very different from an industrial pot. So it's just the local knowledge. They're firing everything with coconut shells, so it cannot be equated to those figures of what terracotta, how much energy it consumes. It's all about integral thinking rather than seeing everything piecemeal. So I started working with, these are all strategies that I'm sort of mentioning here, negotiating how much high-tech, how much low-tech, how much handmade, how much machine-made, what is appropriate to each project, and to design that in the very beginning, those decisions. How much of the money you want to keep in the local economy, how much of outside do you want to bring in for the project to also have this cross-pollination. And so I worked in this case with terracotta insulating tubes that we made specifically for this project, and assembled it in a catenary curve so that we will not require any steel. But you can see the mood, of me it as a quite fresh graduate without any sort of confidence about what will happen. But I think I want to also say that again to the students. I think you'll never know something completely and then you'll start doing it. I think it's okay not to know. You will never know. There are other people who know those things. I think it's important to want to do it, because only when you start doing it, you will complete the learning of it. And I think that is why I did not feel intimidated by what is not known. I tried to take confidence from what we do know rather than what we don't know, and then find what you don't know. Instead of, it's very important to know what you don't know. Otherwise, that's where the mess begins. And not to be offended when somebody tells you that you don't know that. Because you say, oh, that means he knows more than me. And, just work together. So through that kind of experiences, I managed to produce, a couple of buildings which had much less, it used much less resources through engineering, and actually there's no structural steel required. It's an insulated roof compared to the other tile roofs you had in the area, and it was very rapid to assemble. And this was the Frenchman's house that came out of that. That was in 1990, my first project. So, much later, I revisited, I kept going back to the terracotta community and getting further ideas. These are the pots that I used to see them not being able to sell. These were cooking pots. And I eventually developed filler slab systems for as loss shutterings to be able to economize, like waffle slabs, actually cutting down on structural steel, at the same time making the formwork easy. So these are the kind of things I started developing. Jack arches. The thing is, these systems are not new, but setting up the right amount of machine-made, handmade was very important. Like, these are hand extruded by anyone. Anyone can do it. So that was good for the local area. You didn't have trucks coming in to just build. And as always, you can respond very quickly. So, traditional buildings take really long to build. The lime has to set forever. And, even there we added a little bit of cement to make it go faster, etc. So otherwise we couldn't have made it relevant. So this is my house where I now live. When after I got out of that hut, this is a house made with an ancient pre-industrial brick, which is 2.5 centimeters high. It's very much like the Roman brick, actually, with lime mortar. And I just activated that again because I was astonished to find that it was still being made in this area. It's made with the sand, the clay that collects after monsoons. It's just locally made in small amounts. And I decided to celebrate my recognition that what I thought was the bad brick, bad quality brick, was in fact probably the good brick for the future. So that's why I did the house in this material. And you can see some of the other views. So actually, wall house, this became very celebrated. In fact, MoMA has acquired the drawings and the model of this house last year. And it's one of the, probably the most known projects, but it's also because this was my lab. I solved many other materials like ferrocement louvers and many other materials that I wanted to test and to give the craftsmen an opportunity to test also and make mistakes. I thought it's better do it in your own house because they would be under performance pressure with clients. So my house was kind of just mostly made for reasons that everything you see here, including those filler slabs, they were for large span structures elsewhere, but they were tested. So in fact, for me, the house was a real challenge to not make it look like a cacophony of any kind of technology. So I realized that in our times where we really want to come up with alternative ways of building with much less impact, much less environmental impact, and much more positive socio-economic impact, we might need to make radical experimentation, and we need to create rooms for experimentation. And that is very hard, especially to do it in one-to-one scale. For instance, the most radical one that I have been involved in is this project that we called baked in situ mud houses. So there's a Californian potter, Ray Meeker, who had pioneered the technology, and my PhD was about that, to build large-scale mud houses and fire them as if they were kilns, because he realized that in a typical kiln, about 40% of the heat generated is absorbed by the kiln wall itself. Repeatedly, each firing, you lose 40% of the heat. So he thought that these people who have these skills, they make bricks, they know how to fire kilns. So if the house would be the kiln, and you fire it, you fill it with materials, you fill it with your bricks and tiles and ceramic pipes and wash basins, toilets. There's so much in ceramics that we use in architecture. You can produce all that. So the house becomes a producer of materials, local products, rather than a consumer. And through that, you actually can build these mud structures. Even you don't need cement because fire is the cement. So it's a very, very low impact method. And when you cook those bricks, which you have to fire inside, you can later make them in whatever size, you can make whatever products, and then you can sell it and recover even some of the housing costs. And you can use, other ceramic products to complete it. This was a project for a home for homeless children in Pondicherry. That brings me also to another aspect, another strategy of participation. When we talk about the cost of housing across the world, we pay much more percentage of our wages towards housing And that's why many people can't afford housing. It's as simple as that. On one hand, the housing standard, the housing has slipped out of our hands. We used to make our own houses with our friends and neighbors and gradually expand. And now everything is made through big companies. And the companies that are being hired are bigger and bigger with more and more overheads. And they take bank loans, which you have to pay in the end, and you take your own bank loan. So you have to recover two types of bank loans. And earlier, like if you ask children, what is a house? They know it's a place to live, it's for living. Whereas now, for adults, more or less, houses are, your entire life is spent in order to pay off your house, as if the house is an investment. So the commodification of housing and the high costs involved actually call for participatory processes, even in urban context. And I think there's a lot of work being done in this area, and we found that sometimes, and again, design has a big role to play. Through design, you can decide if there are certain things that anybody can do. One cannot be so exclusive that only people have to come from some other city, maybe a company from Singapore, somebody with a lot of certificates and knowledge, and then how are we going to pay that? Obviously, the homelessness will grow if that's how we proceed. So we found that a lot of costs can be offset, or a lot of bank loans can be reduced if one permits people to participate if they want. Some of the projects we did involved that. This is an urban eco-community prototype that we did with rammed earth walls. Not only rammed earth, we only did rammed earth in some areas because we had to spend that much earth from the wastewater treatment plant. We didn't want to just make too many quarries. But these are kind of social housing projects that I have done, which considered participation, and it was really affordable. There are people with various income backgrounds, and you don't even notice, because we don't want to know when you see an architecture what's the income group. That's really disgusting, but now you know, actually, somehow it's like announced in the city. Another one is rethinking materials. See, all the things I showed you previously was not so much about new materials, but about new ways of using age-old, time-tested materials. But there's also a potential to rethink materials. On one hand, the very basic thing is that there's a lot of urban waste, which can be absorbed in buildings. And so we did some amount of experimentation, trying to absorb those into building. But actually, it has not been done. I'm not, on one hand, trying to promote urban waste or encourage that more urban waste is made. On the other hand, maybe those products can be directly reused, like broken glass, etc., rather than buying glass blocks. I think the reason I have used it is mostly with students, to be playful and to help, to give them materials to figure out and feel empowered about designing a technology, because it's a material that is unexpected. So the whole thinking is unexpected. And mostly we have done it for those reasons. But in some projects like these, like that homeless children, the homes for homeless children, there's really no budget. So one would prefer to sometimes change the window size, perhaps, based on the broken cycle wheels that one finds or whatever. So, but that also is another way of working. It means that you design after you've collected some material. So, this calls for restructuring the office even. And this term borrowed from Fry Otto, thinking with the hands. It's really important for me, especially in the studio, to be able to allow this kind of process, especially when the digital world is taking over. I think it can be best supported by opportunities to think with a hand, so that experiential learning could inform design, not only a kind of imagination that is disconnected from oneself. So, there were experiments we've made with books, for example, and actually it sounds maybe provocative, but in reality, books are a very large source of urban waste. I was so shocked when I found out. We started investigating because I had a project in Barcelona. We had to do a pavilion called Library of Lost Books. And we found that in Spain, books have to get burnt. In Australia, they have to get pulped. And there's huge, it's overproduction of books. and nothing, no solution what to do with it. And many of those books are not even opened. So since I had just landed in Madrid to live when I did the Barcelona project, I actually, because of, I always try to use a vernacular technology that looks very easy. So because of all the jamon and all the delicatessen kind of thing, you see this vacuum packing. It's quite household, you know, that type of machines. So we packed the books actually, just symbolically to extend the life like they do for the food, of something that is valued to extend the life. And it was an art thing. So we actually force opened the book and vacuum packed it to at least open it once before it dies, you know, the books. And we made canopies out of that. So this was in Raval, in the Plaza Salvador Segui, near the Filmoteca. And this was the final product. So, Library of Lost Books, that means we don't know what books are also under transformation, and we, you know, what is going to be the place of knowledge in the city. We don't go to the library anymore to borrow books, so everything has to get redefined around knowledge. But in any case, people could read on their own, you know, phones or whatever it was, but it was just a pavilion. It was just fun. It was for expressing liberty. And as you know, all this political situation of Barcelona, it was quite provocative. They gave me the topic of liberty. It was for that 300th year. I didn't want to fall in the trap and talk about the political side, but I wanted to talk about the fact that knowledge makes you free, actually. Consciousness makes you free, because you can't be free, in my opinion. You're always going to be connected to everything else. It's an illusion for me to think that you can define an area, or even if you separate from your spouse, you know, you will have to deal with the children, and you cannot, it's an illusion. So it's your own consciousness that can allow a sense of liberty. And the books were that expression of knowledge, you know, by getting to know about other people's worlds through books. So anyway, this was the space. You can see it's a little borrowed, the geometry from the cobble patterns where orthogonal elements are combined in circular arrangements. So those are things taken from the context. And similarly, these are other things I'm exploring, you know, denim, waste industry, all the jeans that people wear come mostly from India and China. And all the shapes that are not cut out of the fabric are just piled up in heaps and very, very polluting. So we're doing urban fabric workshops. This was in Ahmedabad, in SEPT, where we are trying to look at, students are exploring what can be done with all this waste denim. Actually, these are waste new denim. They have never been used. These are just rests of fabric that was cut out. But again, thinking with the hands is important, because if you didn't involve your hands, you would have not come to certain kinds of designs. Some of these things, including the books, you wouldn't have discovered it if only you were drawing and you never touched the material. So academic collaboration for me always involves exposing students to real-world problems. And on the other hand, I believe, since nobody else is doing the thinking, I really believe in academia, because I think that's the only space where we can really think without economic pressures and all those corporate goals and aims of expanding their kingdoms. So I personally feel in my studio teaching, what I try to do is I try to confront students in the studio to 4 realities, you know, like real scale, real material, real place, and real people. And I think if you can even do something small, a week or whatever it is, you know, and bringing other people of knowledge. For example, if they're working with fabrics, then I always bring, this is a student from Valencia, by the way, this was happening in Ahmedabad, and this is from Bangladesh. He has never seen a sewing machine before, but he needs it for his model. So if you just talk to them about those craftsmen, it's not going to work. I just bring them in the studio, all these other people. It's just for a week. But then they can produce things. For example, here, the students of the AA are building a watchtower in a botanical garden. And, you know, you can see there are craftsmen along with them. I don't believe so much in the design build thing, because I feel there are people who know how to build better than the students whose profession it is to build that. I'm not criticizing those efforts, but I would like to help them to work as an architect, remain in the position of an architect, but to completely know about all these capacities, all these materials, and enter it enough to be able to, enough for their designs to be informed by the real, issues. So I think academia could make its best contribution if we really, to be so theoretical, we would need to connect our students deeply into the ground realities. We must not be a bubble that is for itself. I think we have to serve all the areas and all the problems around us. Many schools are doing that. But I think the best way to do architecture is to apply it already while studying. And so similarly, this is another exercise in Mexico. Just a 2-day workshop. We've recycled these Tetra Pak because Tetra Pak is very hard to dispose. We decided to just fill it back with sand or water and use it as a brick. And in a single 1 or 2 day exercise like this, a student learns so many things. All these various subjects we learn about all these different, construction class, drawing, etc. We can bring everything together in a 1-day workshop because you realize you need to know your geometry, you know how to set how do you mark a curve in a site, and to learn about Eladio Dieste and how those bricks, you learn everything through just 2 days. And that kind of thing can teach you to learn how to learn. That is also important, and to get into the matter. Finally, what is really, really important for me, and I think because the environmental problem is so pressing, that I rely mostly on now much more on not just the knowledge of which materials are harmful, which ones are more benign, but look at engineering as a real savior, because I think finally, knowledge of engineering will allow us to significantly reduce materials. And really, we can't get away without knowing those things. We can't outsource them to software and to other consultants, because we need all that from the very beginning. I'm glad I learned in an old school style, with a lot of technical knowledge, which did not come at the cost of the other aspects. I think everything that exists, it has to manifest. The material aspect will be always embedded. So I'm currently working with this a lot because I'm researching ferrocement since many, many years. It's a thin, compared to concrete, it is, for me, a very futuristic it's a relevant material for the future because it uses so little steel by finely distributing mesh inside the material, and it's only 2.5 centimeters thick. So it gains strength by folding and bending. So I'm working with origami crease patterns, etc., to find out how to achieve bigger spans by folding this thin material in certain ways. So this kind of work calls for full-scale prototypes at conceptual stage. So these are the kind of models we build. The idea is that if this material is so thin and light, then the form work, we're not only looking at new forms, but we're looking at new form work, because form work is the reason why shells and many other complex, many efficient systems are not used, because form work is considered impractical, expensive, and all sorts of excuses. But I'm also working a lot on form work, so that this is a corrugated, recycled cartons, basically, that you can, for instance, fold and carry, unfold, as a form for disaster relief structures, etc. I'm exploring here, see how thin the steel mesh is. I'm exploring systems to build with such few resources and this kind of structure. This is just a prototype, it's not the real house. It's to determine whether that works and then to go back and design. It took us only 4 days to build this. So it's really feasible and it's not expensive, but this exercise, prototype, allows us to take the whole thing further. Take the design further with confidence. So here is the second version of it, the prefab version for homes, etc. We are dealing with kind of Lego blocks that can be manufactured and ergonomically designed enough. The biggest pieces should be possible to carry with 4 people by hand. And unlike in factories, again, we're making easy to do elements that masons could do in their spare time in the backyards of their own homes, so that all those costs are cut back, and you can assemble these pieces whenever there is a house required. In a week, you can put up all these blocks. The cements, colored pigments are already embedded inside like stucco. So this is a project I'm very passionate about. I've called it Fulfill Homes. And it's quite versatile. It's being used for offices and for things. Also, the same material for a bathroom. It can be assembled in a day for, one shower on one side, wash basin in the middle, and a toilet blocks. And these leaning walls allow light and ventilation to come into the room without needing to have windows. So it's protected in the monsoon from the outside, but free. A lot of the things I do now are getting exhibited here and there. So this, for instance, was exhibited. I chose to exhibit this toilet because it was in Zaha Hadid's Roca London Gallery. And I thought it would be quite cool to put this very cheap toilet. It was cheaper than a cheap cell phone. And because those toilets were so expensive, and I thought, it makes it look a bit more luxurious, And it blended in like all my other installations, the gray and the shape and the geometry, everything fitted and blended into that space. Anyway, I would like to end with this, that installations that I'm doing, I found them also as great opportunities to build knowledge and to build community. So I'll start with this one, the exhibition in Venice, 2016, where we displayed the Fulfill Home. Here you see that because we were exhibiting this, I had the opportunity to create collaborations with Mike Schleich at the TU Berlin and to work with very high-end engineers and produce a wide range of inquiries in ferrocement, including natural fibers as well as high-tech carbon fiber and so on. So in this German lab, we had the Indian craftsmen coming in there. We would not find the budget. There's no money for low-cost housing research for some reason. So because even engineers, they want to build the biggest spans and all that. Mike Schleich, what will he do with a 3-meter span? It's embarrassing to ask them. But if you're going to Venice, you can ask them. And then they put their mind, and you can also receive knowledge. And we produced only 6 of those elements in Berlin. And the people who went to Venice won't know this whole detour, of things, and the knowledge that gets built for us in the office through these installations. So we could test one set, and we found out how resilient those. We have much more confidence now to go ahead. But the rest of the pavilion was created by recycling materials from the previous art biennale. We just looked at whoever does whatever, and we didn't buy anything. So we tried to apply the same strategies. Don't buy any materials if possible. Just take what you find and invest in the youth. So we took students from Madrid, and we found out where are the affordability issues around Venice, and we decided to design the 3rd cycle of use. First, it was a German pavilion in the Art Biennale, then it was ours. And after this, we would give it to a refugee community, and there would be students who had studied it before who would work on it. So this was the installation. Some of you might remember. So on one side, we had all the spatial research that was done, or the non-material aspects, and the other side was all the material research displayed with films. And so this was the outcome. So only 6 of those pieces are, where you see the kind of mesh inside it, were produced in Berlin. And this is how it was applied later. The year later, or half a year later, we went back to Venice, dismantled this. And similarly, the previous Biennale, when I worked with Chipperfield, we had built the whole wall house there in 1-to-1 because it was called Common Ground. And I tried to establish that we are more common than we are different. So I had this terracotta. If you look at the building of the Arsenale, the Corderie, you see the terracotta, you see the same bricks, you see the same lime. The building, which was actually designed for South India, which would look out of place in Venice, looks like it belongs to that space, because actually we are more common. Even the arch of this, the shape of the catenary curve is exactly serendipity, the same shape that is the curve of, because the same span. And So these are, to show that the past and the future, it can be in continuity, it doesn't have to be confrontational. Um, Everything was rebuilt, even the garden and everything. Because David mentioned that what he wanted to demonstrate was that the production of architecture involves so many hands, and they were all brought here, and to show that that was the common ground, that it is across places, across people, across disciplines, that architecture, everyone's involved in the making and using of architecture. So here you see the other side. And that for students, this is an incredible opportunity, 6 weeks, going through the entire process, including building it, from design, specification, quantities, and so on. So I would like to end with this image to really, say that as in response to the great urgency to rethink the materiality of architecture, even though architecture is not in the material, I think we really need to recognize that we need to think radically and invest in the building of knowledge and make sure that the continuities over generations, I mean, even in education, we see that the teachers have learned in a different way than the students are learning. We must not make it abrupt. We have to keep the continuity so that students are prepared and empowered to be able to solve the problems they will face and not to feel passive, as if they cannot enter. So I think if you dodge the materiality of architecture, then there'll be a sense of resignation. One can keep on producing fancy forms, but if you don't know how to rethink the technologies, if architects don't design the materiality, like up to Bauhaus and all that, they were all involved. If we withdraw, I really don't know how can we feel empowered again. And for that, we also need to create this cross-disciplinary feeling, like here, you see the craftsmen, you see the engineers, you see people of all disciplines. We must build community across discipline, across cultures, and pool in our knowledge to be able to really boldly face this huge challenge we have. Thank you.